Did the fall affect all of nature? Well, g'day, it is Ken Colson here, Creation Unfolding, so welcome back. Today, I'm going to take a pretty good, long, deep look at Romans chapter 8, verses 18 to 23. I know I've done a couple of videos on that, and I'll put the link in the description for those. But this is going to be a more of an in-depth look at these verses, as I've been studying not just these verses, but a lot of other verses in Scripture and a lot of other concepts in preparation for the new book that I've written, Thorns and Thistles, the Fall, Animal Suffering, and the Problem of Natural Evil. I've got some people looking at it now, and I'm hoping to publish it sometime early next year, so keep an eye open for that. So we're going to look at Romans chapter 8, verses 18 through 23. So what I want to do is I want to look specifically at how to understand this passage from a young earth creationist perspective, and to look at the way a lot of old earth creationists and even theistic evolutionists are now interpreting the passage, because it's really important for young age creationism. So, traditionally, the church has understood the word creation, so that's the Greek word tissis here. Traditionally, they've understood the word creation, it's highlighted in red, to mean the subhuman creation. In other words, animals, plants, trees, the sky, sand, rocks, it doesn't matter. Everything else in creation apart from rational creatures like human beings. So traditionally that's been the interpretation, and in fact even today that's still the majority position or interpretation of these verses. However, in recent years, especially with the rise of theistic evolution in the evangelical church, people have been, old earth creationists, theistic evolutionists have been changing the way in which we've understood this passage, and for obvious reasons, I think. So from an old earth perspective, and particularly from a theistic evolutionary perspective, they understand the earth to be pretty much the same as it was when it was first created. And so things like pathogens and diseases and abnormalities, birth defects, things like natural disasters, so, massive volcanic eruptions or earthquakes, tsunamis, things like this. All of these things, and of course predation as well, so animals killing other animals, all of this was a part of the original creation. And of course, the reason that most old earthers have that view is because of what we see in the fossil record. So when we look in the fossil record, certainly we find lots and lots of predation. We find lots and lots of examples of cancer and all sorts of animal abnormalities in the fossil record, showing that there was quite a bit of suffering and pain in the past. There's also evidence for large-scale natural disasters in the fossil record, I mean on a global scale. So if we look at all of that evidence and we believe that all of those things occurred, over hundreds of millions of years before the fall of Adam and Eve, then you have to believe that the earth as we see it today, according to an old earth perspective, must be very, very similar to the earth as it was originally created. And so when we come to this text and we take the word creation here and we understand it in terms of the natural physical world, we have a problem. Let me read it through, and I think that will become more evident. For I consider that the suffering of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in pains of childbirth until now, and not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. And so you can see from a deep time perspective, if if everything that we see in the fossil record and everything that we see going on today, pathogens, birth defects, abnormalities, disease, cancer, natural disasters, predation, if all of that is normal, and from an old Earth perspective, for most old Earthers, it is, at least for those that have really thought through this issue and have actually interacted with a lot of the science, then there's some real problems with this text if Paul has in mind the subhuman creation, because then what's he talking about? So what they do is they'll interpret the word tissis here as the rational creation. In other words, as human beings. Actually, there are two ways of viewing the text. We'll look at both of them. This is one way. One way is to interpret the word creation in terms of the rational creation or humanity, and I'll get to the other method shortly. So what they do is they say, well, this word creation just means humanity. And in fact, if we put the word humanity in there for the word creation, it helps tremendously. Okay, so go to verse 21, that the creation, humanity, will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. There are still some issues there, as you can see, because we've still got children of God at the end of the sentence there. But it certainly relieves a lot of the issues if we make the word creation humanity. And there are some good reasons to that do support that interpretation. So, for example, there is Colossians 1:23. So in Colossians 1:23, Paul says, if indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which is being proclaimed in all creation. Now, certainly, Paul is using some poetic license here. Okay, so when he says in all creation, I got a feeling he is talking about everything, the whole universe, but he's using it poetically. However, it does seem as though he's speaking of rational human beings. Otherwise, why would you proclaim the gospel to a rock? So, I think because of that, I think it's a applicable interpretation to take the word tissis and interpret in terms of the rational creation. And in fact, of the 38 times that it's used in Scripture, it is always used of created things. Now, importantly, almost all of those times, it's used generally of the subhuman physical creation as a whole, the universe, if you like, the whole created order. Most times, that's the interpretation or that's the meaning that the authors of Scripture want to convey. However, a few times, it does appear in terms of Christians. So, for example, Christians are a new creation in Christ, and so it does occur in that way a couple of times. And twice, only twice, does it have this meaning of the rational creation, both here and in Mark 16:15 as well as the other time where this word is used of rational creation. It might also be once in Romans 8:39, but I don't think so. Anyway, the point being that most of the time it is very, very general, speaking of the universe. That's the way it's interpreted most of the time. However, it can have that meaning, and so making it rational creation or humanity is legitimate, I think. Okay, so what do we do with that then? And I think the real problem for that interpretation is verse 23. If creation in verses 18 through 22 are talking about humanity, human beings, then what in the world is Paul getting at in verse 23? So notice what he says. He says, and not only the creation, but we ourselves. All right, so do you see that he's making a contrast with the creation that he's been talking about prior and us as believers? And I think it's for that reason that I think personally I think the best way to view these verses is in terms of the subhuman creation. Verses 18 through 22 are talking about creation in general, and in verse 23 he's talking about human beings. He's talking about believers. He set up a contrast. And with me, most Greek scholars agree, which is why this is still the interpretation that you'll find in almost all commentaries. In fact, the ones that will disagree are typically those dedicated old earthers or theistic evolutionists who've really done a lot of research and written books on this subject. They're the ones that will typically want to put forward this very, very minority position. But almost all Greek scholars agree that this must mean that this usage of phthisis or creation must be the subhuman creation. So here is a quote from Douglas Moo. He's a Greek scholar, well-known Greek scholar, from his commentary on the book of Romans. Now, he's actually, let me explain here, he's actually talking about another commentator, so that's in the first sentence there, Schlatter. Schlatter also believes that because of verse 23, really there's no way to see the word creation in verses 18 through 22 as meaning anything else except the subhuman, except the subhuman creation. In other words, there's no other way to see it. There's a contrast going on. And so Moo is agreeing with him, but Moo wants to go a step further, okay? So a bit of background as I get into his quote. Moo says, however, while we may agree with Schlatter, because Schlatter is agreeing with both me and Moo, that the transition from verse 22 to 23, the we ourselves, plainly excludes believers from the scope of creation in verses 19 through 22. Okay, we've made that point. Paul's insistence, and this is what Moo wants to get at, in verse 20, that the vanity to which this creation was subjected was not of its own choice, appears to exclude all people, not just unbelievers. And with the majority of modern commentators, then I think that creation here denotes the subhuman creation. And so what Moo is getting at is that in verse 20, it says that the creation was subject to futility, not willingly, not of its own choice. And I think what he's getting at is Adam made a choice. The reason that humanity is fallen is because of Adam's choice. And so I think what he's getting at is that doesn't make any sense. Adam did make a choice. He did choose to disobey God and therefore brought that futility upon himself. So anyway, that is Moo's perspective, it's Schlatter's perspective, and as I said, it's almost all Greek scholars hold that perspective, that the interpretation, the best interpretation for phthisis in this section is the subhuman creation. Okay, so it can't be speaking of humanity. I think that's a very, very small minority position that really doesn't work contextually. But again, those people who are typically committed to an old earth position and a theistic evolutionary position and write a lot about it, do a lot of apologetics on it, they have put forward another idea, and that is, well, okay, we agree. There is definitely, we can see that there is a contrast going on in verses 22 through and 23. Definitely. They understand that. So therefore, something must be different. So they say, well, what's going on then is in verse 23, Paul's talking about believers, but he's talking about unbelievers in verses 18 through 22. And that sounds legitimate at first glance when you think about it, because you are allowing for the contrast. Okay, so the believers, they're the believers, they're the ones who are subject to futility, and we're the ones we still groan inwardly, and we're awaiting redemption, adoption as sons, and the redemption of our bodies. However, there's a really, really big problem with that. And that is, there's several verses through here, but I just want to point to one, and that is verse 19. Let's just look at that one. It says, for the creation, now think of this in terms of unbelievers, okay? For the unbelievers, they wait with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. Now, when Paul says the revealing of the sons of God, he's talking about when Jesus returns, right? And when believers are revealed to the world. And I want to suggest, I really can't see how believers would be eagerly longing for the revealing of the sons of God. And commentators have made the point that this waiting, this eager longing, is a positive thing. Okay? The creation, whatever it is longing for this to happen. But that just doesn't fit if this is talking about unbelievers. And when you look at Revelation 6 through 15, this is made clear. Then the kings of the earth and the great ones and the generals and the rich and the powerful and everyone slave and free hid themselves in caves and among the rocks of the mountains, calling to the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who is seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. So rather than unbelievers, eagerly longing for the revelation sons of God, no, they are trying to hide away from God. So that very, very small minority position really doesn't work either. So I think the best interpretation then is the one that the church has held for 2,000 years. It's the one that majority of commentators hold today, and that is that the word creation here means the subhuman creation. So let's move on now to the second way in which many old earth creationists and theistic evolutionists look at this passage. Because again, for those who have really thought this through, and you'll be surprised, many old earthers haven't really thought through all of these things, and so they're not really aware of the problems until they actually begin to look into both the science and the scriptures. But anyway, what they do is they say, look, this subjection to futility in verse 20, it didn't happen in Genesis 3. We're not talking about the fall here, and that's been the traditional interpretation of the church, for a long time, for 2,000 years. So what they're saying is, we're not talking, Paul's not talking about the fall here. What is going on is Paul is talking about something that occurred in Genesis chapter 1. Now you're probably asking yourself, why put it in Genesis chapter 1? Well, what they want to do is they will say that this subjection to futility is actually something that was built into creation. That's what Paul is getting at. Paul is saying that God built frustration, he built pain, he built corruption into creation from the get-go, from the beginning, and it's got nothing to do with the fall in Genesis chapter 3. And you're probably also saying to yourself, well, hang on a minute, in Genesis 1:31, doesn't it say that everything God had created was very good? And so how can we compare the words very good with words like corruption, or words like groaning, or words like futility and frustration and pain? How do those things go together? Well, what they have to do is they have to interpret the phrase very good in what I would say is a very strange way, one that's not contextually related to Genesis whatsoever. So, for example, if we look at Mark Horton, wrote this book, Peril in Paradise, in 2005. So let me explain the rationale for doing this. Okay, he says, for the perfect purpose paradigm, that's his particular old earth view, he's an old earth creationist, the answer for natural evil is not God's lack of ability to prevent the occurrence of evil. Rather, the answer lies with resolving his goodness with his willingness to permit suffering apart from the sin of man. And that's really important. What he's saying is that what we have to do as human beings, and in order to understand natural evil, we have to understand that God, in his goodness, has actually created a world that has suffering, and it has groaning, and it has corruption built into it, and that it was built into it apart from the sin of man. In other words, apart from Adam's fall. This, in other words, is normal. So everything that we see in the world today is exactly the way God had ordained it to be from the very beginning. And here's why. Going on, the Bible emphatically states that God willingly permits suffering for a brief time in order to accomplish a perfect eternal purpose. There is a greater good than preventing all suffering at all times. So what he's doing is he's appealing to, and rightfully so, to New Testament texts that teach that suffering is actually good for the believer. You can read this in the New Testament in many places, that God uses suffering for our good and ultimately for our eternal redemption, our eternal place in heaven. And so he is right. Horton is right in using those verses. But does that mean we should take those New Testament concepts and we should, anachronistically put them back into Genesis chapter 1? And I would say, I don't think so. I think absolutely not. As it turns out, Genesis chapter 1 has got absolutely nothing to do with Jesus Christ. It's got nothing to do with our eternal salvation as Christians. It's got nothing to do with justification. It's got nothing to do with God sort of honing us and making us into a new creation through our sufferings. It's got nothing to do with that whatsoever. The context has been ripped from other places in the Bible, specifically the New Testament. And this has to be the case. You must interpret very good in this way in order for these verses to make any sense, right? So in order for Paul, if he's actually saying this, to say that in the beginning God created futility, he created all of this pain, he created all of this corruption, because that's what he meant by very good. By creating all of this pain, by creating all of this corruption, it's very good because God has an ultimate purpose in suffering. And that's why they must understand very good in that sense. And it's not just old earthers. This is theistic evolutionist John Garvey in his book, God's Good Earth. And he has a very, very similar view. So he says the pre-fall state is not what is being described in Romans 8. The point being that there was no fall. If you read the title of his book, God's Good Earth, the case for an unfallen creation, he actually doesn't believe that there was a fall. He thinks that when God said everything was very good, that has not been rescinded and the earth is still very good. And so he appeals again to similar kinds of themes that Horton does, and that is that God has built this level of darkness, or this level of pain and suffering into creation, because it's through those things that he wants to better humanity, which will ultimately help us in our eternal redemption. So it's a very, very similar theme to that of Horton. But I think that this idea of taking New Testament concepts and then drilling those back into the concept of very good in Genesis 1 is not good theological practice. The fact is, if we want to have a look and find out what very good means, then we've got to go to the context of Genesis, right? Specifically to the early chapters of Genesis. So what else was going on in the early chapters of Genesis that will contrast with the very good of Genesis 1:31? And I think the obvious contender is Genesis chapter 3, right? And the fall of man. Obviously, this is something that is very, very bad. And so it makes sense that the author of Genesis, when he uses the words very good in Genesis 1:31, in fact, he uses the word good, I think it's 6 or 7 times in Genesis 1, and it culminates in this crescendo that everything is very good. The idea is this is the way God wanted to be made, and then something dramatic happens in Genesis chapter 3 that obviously contrasts with the very good of Genesis chapter 1. So I think rather than look outside of Genesis to find some kind of vague spiritual, redemptive theological concepts to then throw back into Genesis 1, why don't we just look in the context of Genesis 1 through 3? Genesis 3 is obviously the closest contextual contender, not what's going on in the New Testament. So that should be where we look. So what's going on in Genesis chapter 3? Well, we have the fall of man. So that's obviously very bad. What else is going on in Genesis chapter 1? Well, we have the story of Satan entering the snake, and God actually curses, not just Satan, but he actually curses the symbol of the vessel that Satan uses, and that's the snake, or some kind of serpent. We're not actually sure what the animal is. But what is important is that God curses this animal, whatever it is, with some kind of physiological change, so that it changes its mode of locomotion. Also, the other animals in Genesis 3:14, it says that the serpent, or whatever this creature was, is cursed more than the other land animals, which seems to indicate that other animals are cursed, although to a lesser extent. Well, that's obviously bad. And the fact that snakes, or whatever these reptiles were physiologically changed by God means that there are other elements that actually interacted with the physical world. There's also thorns and thistles. This is obviously very, very bad because here you have a productive world agriculturally that is now plagued with inedible, poisonous weeds, thorns and thistles that are obviously going to hinder human flourishing. So that's obviously very bad. It was very bad back then. It's very bad right now. Thorns and thistles affect the world in a dramatic way. There is the pain of childbirth. So it does seem to indicate in Genesis 3 that there was at least some pain before the fall, some kind of a sensation, but it was greatly multiplied because of the fall. So I think that pain in childbirth, I mean, that's very bad as well. And if you look through Genesis 3, there are actually other little facets of change that occurred to the physical world. So even without going to Romans chapter 8, we can certainly say, just given these few things, that the world has changed because of man's fall into sin. There certainly was a cosmic element that has been applied to the world. Now, it doesn't talk about predation in Genesis chapter 3. However, I'll put some links in the description. I've got some links that show that there are other verses that clearly do teach predation. But we want to stay right here in the early chapters of Genesis and Romans. So anyway, the point being that placing this creation being subjected to futility in Genesis 1, it does a real disservice to the meaning of very good, and you really have to interpret very good in a way that's not theologically or contextually really honest to what's going on in Genesis 1 through 3. Now, there are some other problems with this as well. So I want to think about the context of Romans 5 through 7 in general. I mean, what's Paul talking about in Romans chapter 5? Well, he's talking about the fall of Adam into sin, bringing death to all human beings. Now, I don't think Adam is talking about animal death there. I don't. I think he's talking about human death, but we can still use that to help us here in Romans chapter 8. So in Romans 5 to 7, Paul is developing sort of an extended theology of human sin and death, and it finds its underpinning in the transgression of Adam. Paul obviously is deeply involved exegetically in Genesis chapter 3, in what's going on in that chapter and in the fall of man. And so the corruption, right, that we see in these verses, that's associated with this theology and its impact on humans, it really permeates these 4 chapters. That's Romans 5 through 8. And I do use the word corruption to talk about Adam's death because although the word corruption is not used in Romans 5, it is used in 1 Corinthians 15. Paul does talk of human death in terms of corruption. And so I think in Romans 8, Paul he's sort of merely taking his theology one step higher, if you like. He's taking it to the next level, incorporating the rest of the created order. So this is a theme that is contextually sound. It starts off in Genesis chapter 5. It starts off in Romans chapter 5, and it works its way through to chapter 8, where this corruption reaches out into all of creation, and I think that makes the best sense. You know, are we really to believe that Paul is going to use this corruption language, which is the same kind of language that he's been using for Adam's fall into sin? Okay, so are you really going to believe that he's using this corruption language, okay, to describe sort of this desperate state of creation, yet base the explanation for that corruption on an entirely original cause? So if Paul here, for example, is saying that the creation was subject to futility in creation week, that all of this corruption is because God ordained it, that's the way he wanted it in creation week, then that means that the language he's using here, which is very similar to the language of what's going on in Genesis 5, has got nothing to do with the fall in Genesis chapter 3. I don't think so. I think that given the context of Romans 5 through 7, the best way to look at these verses is in terms of sticking with the corruption theme that Paul's been talking about since Romans 5 and incorporating that into the larger part of creation in general. Okay, the third reason why I think that this anachronistic interpretation, it's not going to work, is because it fails to explain creation's switch from its original to its futile states. So think about it. The world that we live in, this is the world that God has subjected. He subjected it to what we see today in Genesis 1, and it was subjected to futility as a one-time event. I have quoted this earlier, but I'll quote it again. This is that Greek scholar Cranfield. The aorist, or patage, refers to a particular event. And so if this word subjected is a one-time event, that indicates a state of change from one kind to another, then where in Genesis 1 do we see that happening? Genesis 1 goes from one motive to the next. In fact, it uses the word good, 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 and it has this climax of very good at the end. You don't see a dip in the language that is used of Genesis 1. And this doesn't make sense given the language that Paul uses here in Romans 8 as well. He uses words like futility and corruption. But these words, they convey a deep sense of loss. They depict a significant change, right, in the natural order from one state to another. In other words, it's as though something was good, then there was a dip in that which was good. There was a significant change, but you don't see that occurring in Genesis 1. So I think that's another reason why that particular interpretation is not going to fly. Now, there are some other contenders. So there's this one by Bethany Soulreader. She wrote this book, God, Evolution, Animal Suffering, is published in 2019. And she proposes that the corruption and the pain and the suffering of creation that we see going on today is not the result of Adam's sin. She says it's the result of individual sin, individual human sin. And she uses some Old Testament texts, which I agree with, by the way. So I think that her interpretation of these texts is correct. But let me explain where she's going. So she uses Hosea 4:1-3, for example. There is no faithfulness or steadfast love, no knowledge of God in the land. There is swearing, lying, murder, stealing, committing adultery. They break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. Therefore the land mourns, and all that dwell in it languishes. And also the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heavens, and even the fish of the sea are taken away. And in the KJV, they're taken away in judgment. And the idea is that Israel, because we're talking about Israel in these verses, their sin is causing the earth itself to mourn. The earth is not being productive. There's blight, there's disease, there's crop failure, more than likely all sorts of weather that's not helpful. And even the animals are taken away in judgment. They're killed because of Israel's sin. And another passage similar to that would be Isaiah 24. And so this Isaiah 24 is talking about basically the end of the world. And these particular verses, 19 through 20, say, the earth is utterly broken. The earth is split apart. The earth is violently shaken. I think that's interesting in of itself, that when Jesus returns, there's going to be no more uniformitarianism. We're going to see catastrophic changes in the crust of the earth. I really think that's what is going on here. But Isaiah goes on, the earth staggers like a drunken man. It sways like a hut. Its transgression lies heavy upon it, and it falls, and it will not rise again. So here, Isaiah seems to be saying that the earth is being judged because of its transgression, its sin. Now, obviously the earth can't sin. So more than likely, Isaiah is talking about the sin of the people. It's the sin of the people. The human beings that live on the earth are causing violent destruction within the earth. And there are other verses in the Old Testament that do indicate that human sin actually does affect the animal realm and the physical rock realm, if you like. This is something that human sin produces. And so I agree with Solarita at that point. But what she wants to say is, she wants to say that that's what Paul's talking about here. So Paul's not talking about a one-time event where Adam sinned and then Adam's sin itself caused all the other different parts of creation to fall and therefore reap corruption and futility. She actually suggests that Adam's sin, the curse on the ground because of Adam's sin, is actually rescinded after the flood in Genesis chapter 9. And then what we see going on after that in the animal realm and in the physical earth realm is due to the sin of, is due to the individual sins of humans. Now, as I say, I agree with Solarita. I do think that human sin does inflict sort of God's judgment upon the physical realm. You reap what you sow. We've seen it clearly in the passages with Israel. As they rebelled against the Lord, there was a corresponding judgment from God on the land, on the animals, on other aspects apart from themselves. And I think that's true generally of all humans. And so, yes, in a very real sense, I think that human sin is reaping corruption in the world. The difference between Solarita and me and, say, Moo and others, because Moo also accepts that and has talked about this, is that the ultimate cause of all of that corruption and pain and suffering is because of Adam's sin. So when Adam sinned, his sin affected every element, every aspect of the world, of the physical world, and caused it to begin groaning. Now, yes, from a human perspective, as they continue to sin, then that continues to add to that groaning. It continues to add to the suffering and to the pain, but its cause is firmly put into Adam's sin. That's the difference between Solarita's position and my position. And I think the reason Solarita wants to do that is because she wants some kind of autonomy, especially for the animal realm, because that's really where she's going when she's talking about her thesis in her book. She wants to talk about why animals suffer, and in order to do that, there has to be a high level of autonomy in the animal realm. They can't be subjected to the sin of Adam. But there are three basic problems with that, this view. Number one, clearly, as we've already seen, Greek commentators have shown that the word subjected, it refers to a one-time event. It is true, I think God does continue to subject earth to futility because of human sin. But Paul's point here, and this is the reason why he uses the verb the way he does, is he's pointing to a single cause, the ultimate, cause of all of these effects. And so for that reason, we have to see this single use of subjection referring specifically to Adam's sin. Secondly, there's the context. We've already looked at the very, very close context that is going on in Romans. Romans 5, Paul is talking about Genesis 3. He's talking about the fall. He's using words like corruption, which has to do with human death. It makes sense that since he's in Genesis 3, then Paul is specifically talking about the sin of Adam. And then, of course, there's verse 22, where it goes on to say, we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in pains of childbirth. In other words, in Solarita's view, there are aspects of the physical realm that are sort of excluded. So, for example, the animal realm is sort of excluded. But Paul is very clear. No, this one-time subjection event and that occurred in Genesis 3 has actually affected the entire world. So again, that's not to say that Solarita is wrong. I think she's right in that human sin does continue this progression of pains and childbirth and groaning. But Paul's point is to put the ultimate cause for all of that into the fall of Adam in Genesis 3. So for that reason, I don't think that Solar Eater's perspective, her hypothesis, is going to work. Now, Solar Eater does have some interesting observations here. She says this: if these commentators are right and Paul is alluding to the curse narrative in Genesis, then, apart from the type of exegesis shown earlier in this chapter, that's her own, those who wish to take the Bible seriously would be hard-pressed to deny the human fall causing a cosmic fall. Or at least that Paul thought it was so. I thought that's incredibly enlightening, because that is ultimately where we've got to go. Which is why we've got to go back to the passage, and I think we've got to see it the way that it's always been interpreted. And if we do that, that the creation here is talking about the subhuman creation, and if this subjection occurred in Genesis 3 because of Adam's sin, now we've got to deal with all of these different descriptors. Paul is saying that the creation was subjected to futility, frustration. He says that the creation is in bondage to corruption. There's two negative words there, the concept of bondage and the concept of corruption, that it is trying to get free from this. He goes on to say that it's the whole creation. So every facet of creation has been groaning, okay, another negative word, with pains of childbirth, which definitely imply a very, very painful experience. And if the creation here is talking about the whole creation, as it is generally used in the New Testament, it has a general view for all of the universe, then every facet is included. And that, I think, is the way that we've got to look at these verses. And if we do that, okay, then we can't have things like earthquakes, devastating earthquakes. We can't have things like tsunamis that are wiping out hundreds of thousands of people. You can't have those kinds of things in this kind of a world. You can't have things like predation. Animals killing each other in extremely painful ways doesn't fit with this interpretation of this passage, because now remember, creation is everything, all right? It's a general word for the whole of creation. It includes what's going on with the animals. It doesn't include things like parasites that cause a blindness in children. David Attenborough uses that particular example to put forward his own atheism. And a lot of people do, and I get it, because if that's the way God designed it, then I totally understand why they would not want to worship that God. So not only that, other things like koala bears here in Australia that are burned every year in bushfires, that die pretty horrible, awful deaths. That also must be included within these verses. That's not something that's good. Surely that is something that fits with what Paul is saying. And I think another example that is really important is some pretty horrific things that were going on with hominids. So this is a paper, it was published in 1999. There's actually an updated version in early 2020s. Someone did an updated version of this paper, so it goes into more detail. But they talk about hominids, sort of Homo erectine, sort of approximately, dated 800,000 years ago from the conventional perspective. And keep in mind that that is before, that is in the pre-fall world from every single old earth creationist perspective out there. No old earth creationist puts Adam at 800,000 years ago. He's a lot more recent than that. So the events that I'm going to describe must have happened in the pre-fall world. Well, in these papers, they talk about children, ages 5, 7, 12, 15, something like that, that are murdered by other people, their bodies taken into a cave, and then they're defleshed using stone tools, cut up, and all of the nutrients are removed from the bones, from the brain case, things like that. So the archaeologists, the paleontologists, I should say, are able to decipher what was going on based on the cut markings on all the bones. The cut markings corresponded to ligament attachment places, things like that. So they know it was humans that was doing this. And because there were other carcasses of other kinds of animals in the cave, it seemed that this was a butcher's cave. They used it to kill their meat, to store it, and then later to eat it. So we're talking about cannibalism. Now, and this is not an isolated case. There are other examples of cannibalism in hominids, and even examples of hominids that are killing other hominids, where they found tool marks in their skull. So we're talking about murder. And as far as I know, every creationist looks at Homo erectus as being human, and certainly from the traditional or the secular perspective, a conventional perspective, Homo erecti are human. And so this is going on to, this is occurring to human beings made in the image of God. And so I find this is probably one of the most difficult things that I struggle with, looking at these verses from an old earth or a theistic evolutionary perspective. How can God look what's going on there before the fall of Adam and say that that is very good? Surely that fits with what Paul's getting at here. Okay, surely it fits with bondage to corruption. Surely it fits with groaning and pains of childbirth. These things, they're not normal. These things are the result of the fall of humanity into sin. Which means then that the world that we see today, although it deceptively looks like nothing's changed, it looks normal. And in fact, we're told on nature programs that everything is normal, right? It's a circle of life. If we take the Bible seriously, the Bible seems to indicate, no, there's been a huge change in the natural order, a massive change where death, suffering, predation, pain, natural disasters were at one time excluded. Now they make up what's going on in the world. And I think the Bible does describe those things. I think it's difficult for us to imagine because we live here, right? We live in this world, and really not much has changed in the last, from a young earth creationist perspective, not much has changed in the last sort of 5,000 years. Things have been like this since after the flood. Well, actually, they were the same before the flood, but my point being, there hasn't been a lot of biological change or a lot of geologic change since the few centuries that occurred just after the flood. Things have been pretty stable. And so I think that causes us to reflect on the world and think that it's normal, that that's the way it's supposed to be. But we need to have faith, right? If we take scripture at face value, that no, the world was a very different place. All of these things are invaders in the world. They're enemies in the world. They're not what God originally designed. And I think that's very hopeful for people struggling, right, with cancer or disease, or a child that has an abnormality. Because now we can, although we don't have all the answers, we know that human sin, the fall of humans into sin, our own sin, okay, as well, has affected the world in negative ways. But, if we understand these verses in terms of the non-human creation, then there's hope, right? Paul talks about essentially not just the redemption of humanity, but the redemption of the world. And again, that fits with the Bible. Isaiah talks about the new heavens and the new earth, and he describes the natural realm as being changed in very positive ways. So it's not like Paul here is drawing on a vacuum. He's drawing on a rich theological perspective that comes from the Old Testament, talking about the restoration of the earth. So, look, I trust you are blessed by this video. It was a little bit long, but we did go into quite a bit of depth, and I pray that it would be useful to you as you go out there into the world talking to people who maybe perhaps hold an old earth or a theistic evolutionary position. So that's all from me, Ken Colson here at Creation Unfolding. Please go ahead, if you thought this video was helpful in any way, then go ahead and pound that like button. Look, I'd really appreciate it. It really helps. Subscribe and ring the bell for easier access to more videos. Look, if you want to give, I'd really appreciate that too. You'll find a link to PayPal in the description. And as always, please just spend a few seconds and pray for me. I really appreciate that. Thank you and goodbye.